My name is Natalie Hayes. I'm 33 years old and I live in Seattle, Washington. From the outside, my life might look steady. I have a good career as a software designer. I live in a quiet apartment filled with books and little things I love. But what most people don't see is the weight I've carried for years. The weight of being the daughter who was always compared, always second, always overlooked. And then came last Christmas. It happened with a single message from my mother. 8 words, short and sharp. This year, just your sister's family. Keeping it small, I read it again and again. Each time it cut a little deeper. No explanation, no warmth, just the clean certainty that once again I was out. My sister Danielle and her family would sit at the table while I would be erased. I typed back one word, enjoy, and set my phone down. My hands were shaking, but my eyes were dry. It wasn't the kind of wound that brings tears. It was the kind that hollows you out. And maybe, if you're listening to this, you know that feeling too. That moment when someone you love tells you, without saying it, that you don't belong. If you've ever sat with that same ache, if you've ever felt invisible in your own family, just know, you're not alone. That's why we share these stories here, so people like us can quietly nod and say, yes, I've been there too. That night, as the city outside my window carried on with its holiday lights and laughter, I realized something. That message from my mother wasn't only rejection, it was a strange kind of permission. Permission to stop begging for a seat at their table, permission to build one of my own. When I put my phone down that night, staring into the quiet glow of Seattle's skyline, memories began to surface. Uninvited, but impossible to stop. It was as if those 8 words from my mother had unlocked a vault inside me, spilling out years of moments I had tried to bury. I remembered being a little girl, maybe 8 years old, sitting cross-legged by the Christmas tree. Danielle, my older sister, was beside me, her face glowing with excitement. She tore open a box to find a gold bracelet that sparkled under the lights. My mother leaned in, kissed her cheek, and whispered, "You deserve this, sweetheart. You've made us proud, and me?" I searched under the branches, hoping for something with my name on it. There was nothing. My mother glanced at me awkwardly and said, "You're older now. You probably don't need toys." I smiled politely, but inside, something cracked. That was the first time I understood that in our family, love had a hierarchy. Danielle was at the top, and I was somewhere near the bottom. It didn't stop with gifts. When Danielle made cheer captain in high school, my parents threw a party, balloons and banners across the living room. When I won the science fair the same year, my mother muttered, "That's nice, honey." Don't stay up too late working on projects. I still remember the way my heart tightened. I had wanted to shout, "See me! Look at me!" But I swallowed it down, the way children often do, and learned a lesson that stuck. My accomplishments would never matter as much as Danielle's presence. The unfairness grew sharper as I grew older. When Danielle joined the debate team, my father cleared an evening so the whole family could attend. But when I rebuilt a broken computer from scraps in our garage, a project that took me weeks, my dad never looked up from the evening news. Machines became my refuge. They didn't care who my sister was. They didn't compare, didn't play favorites. Either they worked or they didn't. And in the quiet hum of wires and circuits, I found the recognition my family never gave, but even then I longed for their eyes on me. When I earned a scholarship to Stanford, I thought surely this time they'll be proud. But my father only said, "That's far away." Danielle's staying close to home. His tone wasn't congratulation, it was inconvenience. That was the moment I stopped expecting anything. I realized I could climb every mountain, win every medal, and they would still look past me to see only Danielle. I tell you this not to dwell on bitterness, but because so many of us carry scars like these. Scars that don't always come from violence or harsh words, but from the soft and steady neglect of being unseen. Sometimes silence is the sharpest betrayal of all. Looking back now, I understand that my parents' favoritism wasn't just careless, it was its own form of betrayal. They had 2 daughters, but they chose to pour their love into one while letting the other wither in the shadows. That night in Seattle, phone still on the table beside me, those memories pressed down hard. And I realized that my mother's message wasn't new. It was simply the latest verse in a song I'd been hearing all my life. But what I didn't know then was that this was only the first betrayal. Years later, even after I fought tooth and nail to build a life of success, even after I carved a place for myself out of nothing, the second betrayal would cut even deeper. By the time I left for college, something inside me had already hardened. I no longer expected my parents' applause, no longer hoped for their approval. I told myself, if they won't see me, then I'll make the world see me. I moved into a cramped dorm room at Stanford with nothing more than a battered suitcase, a second-hand laptop, and a determination that burned hotter than any holiday fire. While Danielle stayed close to home, basking in the comfort of family dinners and familiar praise, I lived on instant noodles, stretching every dollar of my scholarship. I worked late nights at the campus library, held part-time jobs fixing old computers, and spent weekends coding until my eyes blurred. The truth is, it wasn't glamorous. Success never is, in the beginning. There were nights I cried into my pillow because I couldn't afford the heating bill, mornings when I walked to class with wet hair because the shower in my apartment was broken and I had no money to fix it. But every hardship felt like a brick, and brick by brick I was building something solid, something mine. When graduation came, I didn't have family in the crowd. My parents claimed it was too far to travel. Danielle had a recital that weekend, and they didn't want to miss it. I looked out at the sea of cheering families and waved at no one. But inside, I whispered to myself, "You're still here. You made it." After college, I threw myself into the world of tech startups. Long nights turned into longer years. I failed more times than I can count, investors who walked away, prototypes that collapsed in front of me, entire months when I wasn't sure I could pay the rent. But each failure was a teacher, and each scar made me sharper. Slowly, things began to shift. I gathered a small team, people who believed in the vision I carried. We worked in a basement office where the walls sweated in summer and froze in winter, but in that humble place, we built a product that changed everything. It caught attention, first from small investors, then from larger ones. And then, after years of surviving on coffee and scraps, the breakthrough came. A Fortune 500 company made an acquisition offer, $120 million. I still remember that moment vividly. I stood in my kitchen, holding the phone, staring out the window at the rain-soaked streets of Seattle. It felt unreal, as if the years of loneliness, hunger, and struggle had finally birthed something tangible, something undeniable. I thought, this is it. This is the moment they'll finally see me. That night, I called my parents. My hands shook as I dialed, like a child about to show them a perfect report card. When my father picked up, I told him the news. "Dad, they want to buy my company. $120 million. There was a long pause. Then he sighed, almost bored. "Well, technology is hard to understand, but you know, your sister Danielle just got promoted at her firm. We're so proud of her." Just like that, my triumph was swallowed by silence. My mother chimed in, but not to congratulate me. She asked if I planned on coming home for Danielle's celebration party. It felt like ice water poured over a flame. Years of struggle, years of sacrifice, reduced to a shrug and a change of subject. That was the second betrayal. The first had been in childhood when my achievements were invisible, but this was different. I had carved a piece of the world with my bare hands. I had fought, starved, worked myself to the bone, and still, I was the shadow. Still, Danielle was the sun. For a long time, I carried that phone call like a stone in my chest. I replayed it on lonely nights, wondering if there was something wrong with me, if maybe I was unworthy of pride no matter what I did. But over time, the pain transformed into something else, a kind of clarity. If I could build a company from nothing, then perhaps I could also build a life where I didn't need their approval. If I could survive without their presence, maybe I could thrive without their praise. That's when I bought land in Aspen, 42 acres of stillness wrapped in mountains and pine. I oversaw the construction of a lodge, not as a symbol of wealth, but as a sanctuary. I chose the cedar beams by hand, designed the fireplace to burn warm and low, and furnished every room not for show, but for meaning. It wasn't just a house. It was a declaration. I exist. I matter. Even if you never say it, I will say it to myself. Standing on that land, breathing in the clean mountain air, I felt something for the first time in years: peace. It didn't erase the scars, but it gave them space to heal. And I thought, maybe one day this lodge would become more than a home. Maybe it could be the place where I stop chasing invitations and start creating them. The day I signed the papers for the lodge in Aspen, I thought I was simply buying silence. A place where the noise of comparison, the ache of never being enough, couldn't reach me. But as Christmas approached and the memory of my mother's 8-word message still echoed in my chest, I began to see the lodge differently. It wasn't just shelter. It was a chance to start over, to build a table where no one sat in shadows. I picked up the phone and called Rachel, my cousin. She and I had always shared a quiet bond, the kind formed between people who knew what it meant to be overlooked. "Did you get invited this year?" I asked softly. Rachel laughed bitterly. "No, just Danielle's family, as usual." That's when it clicked. It wasn't only me. My parents' favoritism didn't just cut me out. It cut out anyone who didn't orbit around Danielle. So I said, "Rachel, come to Aspen. Bring your kids. I'll take care of everything." At first, she thought I was joking. But when I told her I meant it, her voice shifted. Relief, gratitude, even disbelief, all tangled together. "Natalie, thank you." Welcome word spread quickly. Within days, messages trickled in from relatives who hadn't attended a family Christmas in years. Aunt Marion, who always lingered at the edge of gatherings, Uncle Ray, quiet as a shadow, Eli, a distant cousin with a guitar who never quite fit in. One by one they said yes. It turned out I wasn't the only one hungry for a different kind of family. In the weeks that followed, I poured myself into preparing the lodge, not with luxury, but with intention. 10 bedrooms became 10 small sanctuaries. For Aunt Marion, I stacked novels on the nightstand, the kind she once told me made her live another life. For Rachel's children, I wrapped Lego sets and wrote their names in big, bold letters so they'd know the gifts were truly theirs. For Grandma, the only one who had ever tried, however gently, to soften my mother's sharp edges, I left a box of imported tea and a hand-knitted scarf beside her bed. Every detail whispered, "You are seen. You belong here." On Christmas Eve, as the first SUV crunched up the snowy hill, my heart pounded so hard it felt like it might bruise my ribs. Rachel stepped out, her breath fogging in the cold. When she saw the lodge glowing against the mountains, she turned to me with wide eyes. "Natalie, you built a world!" Her children squealed when they saw the train running around the Christmas tree inside. Aunt Marion clutched the stack of books to her chest as though I'd handed her something lost decades ago. Eli unpacked his guitar with tears in his eyes. Even Uncle Ray, who rarely spoke, gave me a hug that lasted a second too long. It said everything words never could. That night, the dining room table stretched long beneath embroidered linen, candles flickering, pine-scented air filling the room. There was no kids' table, no hierarchy. Every seat held the same weight. When we sat down together, I noticed something strange and beautiful. No one fidgeted. No one looked nervously toward the head of the table, waiting for approval. Instead, laughter bubbled easily. Stories flowed. The children leaned in, eyes wide, listening as the older ones shared memories long buried. Eli strummed his guitar softly, filling the air with songs that felt older than the snow outside. Rachel's kids built their Lego sets under the tree, their giggles weaving into the music. Grandma sipped her tea, her eyes shining as she reached across the table to squeeze my hand. For the first time, I wasn't the invisible daughter, the afterthought. I wasn't fighting for scraps of recognition. I was simply home. As dessert was served, Grandma leaned close and whispered, You gave us a real Christmas, Natalie. A Christmas built on love, not show. I couldn't answer. My throat was too tight. I only nodded, letting her words sink deep, like healing salve on an old wound. That night, after everyone drifted off to their rooms, I sat alone by the fire. The house was quiet, save for the crackle of logs and the faint hum of wind outside. I thought about all the years I had begged for a place at a table that was never meant for me, and here, now, I had built one of my own. The irony struck me. My parents had excluded me to keep it small. Yet by doing so, they had opened the door for something bigger than I had ever imagined. A family not bound by favoritism, but by choice. For the first time in decades, I felt the ache inside me ease. I realized that belonging isn't something handed down from blood, it's something we create when we choose to see one another. And that Christmas, in the glowing heart of the lodge, surrounded by people who had once been forgotten, I finally saw myself too. The morning after Christmas, I woke to the smell of cinnamon rolls drifting from the kitchen. Snow was falling outside, the world hushed and white. For the first time in years, my chest felt light. The night before had been everything I never thought possible. Laughter, music, the warmth of family chosen, not assigned. But peace never lasts long when the past comes knocking. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, 6 missed calls, all from my mother. A text from Danielle followed, sharp and cutting. "Really cheap move, Natalie. Enjoy your little show." My stomach dropped, old reflexes surged, guilt, doubt, the ache of being the problem child. For a moment, I thought of ignoring it. But then, the phone lit up again. Another call. This time, I answered. I put it on speaker. Grandma sat across from me, tea in hand. Her eyes told me she was ready to hear what they had to say. "Natalie," my mother hissed, her voice brittle with outrage, "do you have any idea what you've done? Everyone is talking. The pastor even mentioned it at service. Do you realize how this makes us look?" I sat still, my tone even. "You told me this year was just Danielle's family." I didn't trouble anyone. I kept it small. There was a pause, then my mother's voice tumbled out, frantic and insincere. "We thought you'd be busy." "Danielle just had the baby. You always have work. We didn't mean—" I cut in quietly, but firmly. "She's always the center, isn't she?" The silence on the line was heavy, like the air before a storm. And then, Grandma set her teacup down with a soft click. She leaned forward, her voice steady and sharp as glass. "Judy." "Robert, that's enough. You've spent a lifetime pretending this child didn't exist. Last night, for the first time in years, I saw her do what none of you ever did. She gave this family a place to belong." The words struck harder than any scream. My father tried to defend himself. "Mother, you're exaggerating." "We never meant—" But Grandma cut him off. Her tone carried both sorrow and steel. "No, you didn't see. And that's the problem. Natalie begged for your attention with every science fair ribbon, every scholarship, every accomplishment. You gave her silence. You gave Danielle parades for simply showing up, and left Natalie to carry the weight of the world with not even a nod." I stared at the fire crackling in the hearth, my eyes burning. It wasn't me saying the words. It was someone else. Someone who had seen, who had carried her own quiet grief at the way her daughter, my mother, had failed so deeply at the one job that mattered, loving both her children. On the phone, my mother's voice shrank. "I never meant to hurt anyone," Grandma snapped, her words sharp but not cruel. "But you did? And now it's done." My father tried again, softer now, as if shrinking into himself. "Maybe we missed some things." But Natalie never said anything. We didn't know for the first time in decades I spoke the truth aloud. My voice was quiet, but it carried weight. I did say something. Every time I showed up, every time I tried to make you proud, I was saying it. You just didn't hear me. The fire popped, sending a small spark into the air before fading. My hands trembled, but I kept them folded in my lap. "I think that's enough," I whispered. "We can talk later if we need to." And with one simple press of a button, I ended the call. The silence afterward was deafening, but not heavy. It was freeing. Grandma reached across the table, her hand steady on my shoulder. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. In her silence was both pride and sorrow. Pride that I had finally claimed my voice, sorrow that it had taken this long. I realized then that I had been waiting all my life for someone else to name me worthy, but I didn't need their words anymore. The truth had been spoken, not by me, but for me, and that was enough. Later that morning, as more cousins gathered in the living room sharing photos and laughter, the weight in my chest began to lift. The family chat buzzed alive with jokes, caroling videos, snapshots of kids in the snow, and not one message mentioned my parents or Danielle. It was as if the gravity of our family had shifted, no longer revolving around the ones who refused to see us, but around the ones who chose to. For the first time, I felt it deep in my bones. The betrayal that once defined me no longer held me. I wasn't the forgotten daughter anymore. I was the one who built the table, and others had gladly taken their seats. A week later, the snow still lay heavy over the lodge, the pines bending gently under its weight. The house was quieter now. Most of the family had gone home, their laughter lingering only in the echoes of rooms and in the photographs still scattered on the table. That was when the SUV arrived, slow, hesitant, winding its way up the hill as though even the car itself wasn't sure it belonged here. My parents stepped out first, my father stiff, his face unreadable, my mother pulling her scarf tight like armor. Danielle came last, polished and composed, her expression a mask I'd seen my whole life. I didn't smile, I didn't sneer either. I simply opened the door and let them in. Dinner was quiet. Roast beef, mashed potatoes, red wine. The silverware clinked softly, filling the silence that no one dared to break. It wasn't the kind of silence that comes from peace. It was the kind that hums with things unsaid. Finally, I spoke. My voice didn't shake. "Do you remember the Christmas when Danielle got the gold bracelet and I got nothing?" No one answered. My mother blinked quickly, her eyes darting to the table. "Do you remember when I won the science fair and you told me not to stay up too late? Or when I earned a scholarship to Stanford and all Dad said was that it was too far away?" My father shifted in his chair, eyes fixed on the rim of his glass. My mother's lips parted, but no words came. I kept going, calm, precise, not angry, not pleading, just truth laid bare. When Forbes named me to their list. When I sold my company. Do you know what I waited for? Just once, for either of you to say, "We're proud." But all you could do was turn the conversation back to Danielle. The words hung heavy in the air. Danielle finally looked at me, not with superiority this time, not even pity. Her gaze was emptier, but somewhere deep in it flickered something I had never seen before, regret. For a long time, no one spoke. Then my father sighed, his voice low. Maybe I didn't see it all. My mother whispered, almost inaudible. I was proud. I just didn't know how to say it, and for the first time I didn't reach for their words like a starving child. I didn't ache for more. I simply nodded because whether they meant it or not, I no longer needed it. They left that night without promises, without hugs, without the grand reconciliation stories like to end with. And that was fine, because when the door shut behind them I realized I didn't need them to change. I had already changed. Later, I stood on the balcony, snow falling slow and soft around me, a glass of wine warming my hand. The mountains stretched dark and endless, the kind of silence that holds truth rather than emptiness. I whispered into the night, I don't need permission to matter. I have built my own table. And in that moment, I felt free. Free from the ache of waiting to be chosen. Free from the hunger for approval. Family, I realized, is not always the people who share your blood. Sometimes it is the people who choose to sit at your table, who see you, who love you without condition. And if this story touched something in you, if you've ever been overlooked or pushed aside or left out, I hope you'll stay with us. Because here we share family stories that remind us, even in betrayal, healing is possible. Even in silence, love can be found. Like, subscribe, and join us for more, because none of us should walk through these stories alone.